Well, staying with this story then, Andrew Smith, who's a senior lecturer in contemporary history and politics at the University of Chichester, joins me in the studio. Andrew, thanks for coming on the show today. So why would Boris Johnson just not step down immediately?
Well, it does seem like that ship has rather sailed. We would sort of expect maybe that Dominic Raab, his essentially Deputy Prime Minister, would stand in for him after the resignation. But this is something that seems to be dragging on. And there are some stories in the press this morning that it seems partially to be about the venue he's booked for his delayed wedding party later in June. Invites are already out with, of course, his grace and favour place at Chequers in Buckinghamshire being the venue. Otherwise, Johnson wants to kind of look out for a sense of transition himself and to play this caretaker role, it seems. So he is holding on. Of course, we had this sort of unrepentant speech. Is he out? Is he not out? He has resigned, but as you say, he's going to stay in place, he says.
And didn't even use the word resign, which is
no.
surprising. So what's the process then, Andrew, for choosing the next Tory party leader?
Sure. Well, so the 1922 committee, which is the kind of steering party for the Conservative Party, will have an election on Monday for some of its kind of council executives. After that finishes, they will then set out the process for electing a new leader. Normally, what it means is that there are a series of internal elections, a series of rounds, until you get down to two candidates. The voters within that are the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Once you get down to two candidates, it moves beyond that to the wider Conservative membership. And that seemed to be an important process for the Conservatives because, of course, with someone like Theresa May, there was seen as a real weakness of the fact that she didn't really connect with many sort of wider voters. And so that idea of putting it to the wider membership is something that I think we will see happen this time especially.
So who do you think are the most likely successors? There's no shortage of candidates, surely. I think they've been described as wannabes in the British press this morning. Who's going to be a frontrunner?
Well, there's a wonderful line in the Spectator this morning, which is that the Conservative leadership election is a little bit more like the Grand National than the Derby. It's crowded, unpredictable, and the favourite often falls. Now, that said, I think there are a lot of different options we could be looking at. Of course, if this had been something like 6 months ago, we'd probably have said Rishi Sunak. He is, the sort of dishy-rishy figure that people threw about, the kind of younger city boy Chancellor. Of course, he's been tarnished slightly by scandals around his wife's taxes, of course, by his involvement in Partygate as well. Others that will likely come out, we've seen Tom Tugendhat, who's a kind of a backbencher, much more vocal on foreign affairs, a former soldier, and there's a sense that some of the kind of centrists in the party favour him, but that's maybe not the most likely. Others, Steve Baker, of course, the sort of Brexit hardliner that Johnson reaches for whenever there are problems, will speak very clearly to the ERG. Others, Sajid Javid, likely, a former Chancellor who resigned because of a row with Dominic Cummings, now was Health Secretary before he made that very angry speech about integrity in politics. I mean, we could go on and on. Probably the most one of the dark horse kind of candidates is Penny Mordaunt. She's seen often the Portsmouth MP. She was a Royal Navy reservist. She's seen to combine a certain kind of liberal liberal position with the fact she voted for Brexit and seemed to be quite attractive to many people. Ben Wallace is another one that's been very favourable. He was the Defence Secretary, very strong in Ukraine, very critical of the exit from Afghanistan, spoke very emotionally about it, and also ran Johnson's campaign in 2019. So, runners and riders all over the place. Who knows? We will see who eventually makes that finish line.
Lot of cliffhangers, Andrew. So to finish, Britons have been dealing with Brexit, inflation, Boris Johnson scandals. You mentioned there's a lot of political diversity on all of those possible successors. So how do you think all of this will, A, affect Conservatives' popularity, and B, affect perhaps the priorities, the direction that the Conservative Party will take moving forward?
Absolutely, it's a good question. Like we say, with the variety of different approaches and policies on offer with each candidate, I think really this will depend on that direction. So one of the big trends most recently has been that in, I guess, what you might call the blue wall, that the Tories have faced losses really against the Lib Dems. Why? Because Labour looks less scary and people feel like they can support the Lib Dems because the Conservatives have been so scandal-ridden and all the rest of it. And so there is a kind of need to speak to those sort of one nation Tory types in the south of England. Likewise, of course, we know there's been a lot of talk always about the so-called red wall. And that, of course, is the Northern English seats, A lot of big wave of that in 2019. That seemed to be more about sort of investment and identity politics. And that favours certain candidates who are on the right of the party. And so there's going to be a real strategy. And that's where it appeals to somebody like Penny Mordaunt, who perhaps is able to speak to a sort of Brexit voting audience. Brexit's done, but it still lingers as something which influences votes within the party. But likewise address a much more sort of centre-right audience, perhaps, in terms of its economic priorities. So the candidate will be hugely influential, but lots and lots of ground to cover before that eventually gets decided.
Lots of ground to cover, lots of unknowns, lots of cliffhangers, and lots of perhaps instability, it sounds like, in listening to you. Andrew Smith, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.